The crystal chandeliers of the Michelin-starred restaurant in downtown Boston cast a sharp, fractured light across the mahogany table. It was the 40th wedding anniversary of Arthur and Evelyn Vance, a grand celebration designed less to honor 4 decades of marriage and more to exhibit the family's flawless social architecture. Julian, my husband, was holding court at the center of the table, his voice carrying that smooth, Ivy League cadence that automatically commanded the room. He was recounting a multi-million-dollar corporate acquisition his firm had just closed, navigating the financial jargon with practiced, theatrical ease. For 12 years, I had sat at the edge of these exact conversations, an observer in my own life. But that evening, the discussion veered directly into the legal complexities of defense procurement regulations, a niche domain of international trade law, where I had spent years managing high-stakes cases for the military. I waited for a natural pause, took a quiet breath, and offered a precise, structural perspective on the compliance risks involved. Before the final syllable could leave my lips, I felt Julian's hand my wrist under the table, a swift, heavy pressure that instantly cut me off. He didn't look at me. He simply redirected the conversation back to his own narrative without missing a beat. Across the table, his father, Arthur, a retired corporate law titan who viewed the legal world through the lens of billion-dollar boardrooms, let out a chickthung, patronizing smile. "Well, Clara," Arthur said, swirling his vintage Bordeaux, "those macroeconomic policies are best left to the minds handling real corporate strategy. You just focus on the administrative paperwork at the base. Leave the heavy lifting to the men." Evelyn offered a soft, dismissive nod into her silk napkin, and the table laughed in unison. They knew I had obtained my law degree through an Army-funded education program at a public university, rather than a legacy seat at Harvard or Yale. In their minds, a military lawyer was an oxymoron. A glorified clerk handled low-level, disciplinary infractions and minor administrative disputes. I was just the girl from a modest background who had gotten lucky by marrying into New England old money. I sat perfectly still, adjusting the linen napkin in my lap. I let the laughter wash over me, choosing the absolute sanctuary of silence. It wasn't because I was broken. It was because I had spent a decade in uniform learning that when people are blinded by their own arrogance, trying to correct them is an expensive waste of spirit. I swallowed the slight, filed it away, and kept my eyes on my 10-year-old daughter, Lily, who was watching me from across the table with quiet curiosity. Julian ordered another bottle of expensive French wine later that evening, gesturing to the sommelier with a flick of his wrist, never once opening the leather-bound menu to check the price or the vintage. It was a minor habit, but it spoke volumes about the structural foundation of our marriage. Julian operated under the absolute assumption that the universe was custom-built to accommodate his preferences and his timeline. He ordered for the table because he believed he possessed the superior palate. He dictated our family schedule because he believed his hours were inherently more valuable than mine. Underneath the polished, magnetic charm that had captured me at 26 was a man who sustained his identity by ensuring he was always the smartest, most dominant person in every room he occupied. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped correcting him when he assumed he was. It was simply easier to fade into the background than to engage in a war of attrition against an ego that required constant validation. I had transitioned into an administrative command role within the Army Reserve specifically to provide stability for Lily, planning my operational deployments around her school calendar, so she would always have a present parent. To the Vance family, however, my uniform was merely an inconvenient hobby, a quirky weekend obligation they tolerated with thin smiles at holiday dinners. They never asked about the international treaties I had dissected or the courts-martial panels I had guided. They didn't want the reality of Clara Vance. They wanted the convenient fiction of an compliant, quiet army wife who knew her place at the foot of their table. I let them keep their illusions. As the dinner wound down and Julian raised his glass for a final, self-congratulatory toast, I looked at the polished wood of the table and realized the marriage had ended long before the paperwork had even been drafted. I was done shrinking myself to keep them comfortable. The silence I had built over 12 years was no longer a shield to preserve the peace. It had become a fortress where I was quietly gathering my strength, waiting for the exact moment to stand my ground. Part 2. Stormis beneath a polished roof. The betrayal did not arrive with a dramatic confrontation. It unfolded quietly through the cold, unyielding numbers of a monthly financial statement. 8 months ago, while reviewing our joint investment portfolios late at night, I noticed a series of anomalous, vague line items categorized as miscellaneous corporate expenses. Following the digital paper trail with the meticulous precision I had honed during years of contract fraud investigations, I uncovered a reality that fractured the remaining illusions of my marriage. There were recurring hotel charges in cities Julian had supposedly never visited, coinciding perfectly with encrypted text exchanges on an old device he had forgotten to wipe. The name Melissa Chen, a junior partner at his financial firm, was woven through a year's worth of hidden transactions. When I presented the evidence, Julian didn't flinch, nor did he offer the hollow currency of a modern apology. Instead, he looked at me with a detached, clinical indifference, as if he were closing a non-performing branch of his business. Within a week, he filed for divorce, retaining Harrison & Croft, the most aggressively expensive family law firm in the state, at a staggering rate of $950 an hour. His initial petition was a declaration of total warfare. He demanded sole ownership of our historic home, the entirety of our joint liquid assets, and primary physical custody of our 10-year-old Lily. He intended to write off 12 years of my life as a mere liability. However, Julian's fatal mistake was operating under the assumption that I would respond like a panicked civilian. He believed I would exhaust my modest savings on a retail attorney, or worse, surrender out of pure intimidation. I chose instead to exercise my right to proceed pro se, representing myself. Under the strict rules of American civil procedure, the discovery phase is the crucible where cases are won or lost. I knew that hiding evidence until the trial, the cliché of Hollywood dramas, was a procedural myth. Any document not disclosed in discovery would be instantly barred by a competent judge. Therefore, I spent months methodically compiling a comprehensive financial binder. I unearthed a hidden corporate entity, a shell LLC registered in Julian's name, just 4 months prior, and mapped a suspicious transfer of $43,000 from our joint marital savings into an individual account controlled entirely by his sister, executed mere weeks before his filing. I explicitly included these documents, labeled clearly as Exhibit G and Exhibit C, in the formal discovery packets delivered to Harrison & Croft's Glass Tower offices. I hid nothing from the law. I simply trusted that their absolute contempt for my public university background and my military status would act as a perfect, self-inflicted blindfold. The strategy operated flawlessly. When Preston Cole, the sharp, tailored young associate leading Julian's legal team, received the discovery filings from a spouse representing herself, he barely glanced at them. To a firm accustomed to litigating against high-priced corporate entities, a packet assembled by a military officer working without counsel looked like an amateur's desperate bluff. During our final mandatory deposition, Julian had leaned across the glass table and murmured to Cole, loud enough for me to hear, "Don't sweat the extra disclosures. It's just old, redundant paperwork from a closed account. She's throwing rocks in the dark." Cole had nodded, a smirk playing on his lips, assuming that a woman who spent her weekends in utility uniforms couldn't possibly possess the sophisticated acumen required to unravel high-level asset thotan. They left the documents unexamined, failing to verify the active status of the LLC or the fraudulent nature of the sisters' loan. That evening, I sat alone beneath the single pendant light of my quiet kitchen, the house echoing with the absence of Julian's expensive footsteps. Outside the window, Lily's wooden stick-do hung perfectly still in the moonlight, a silent reminder of the only stake that truly mattered in this calculated game. I felt no burning anger, no desperate urge for theatrical vengeance. My mind had transitioned fully into the cold, strategic clarity of a judge-advocate, I was not preparing an emotional plea for a family court. I was constructing an unbreakable perimeter, waiting patiently for my opponent to walk into the open terrain he had so confidently designed for my defeat. Part 3. Ein epoch under the domus of justice. The Tuesday morning of the hearing arrived damp and heavy, a thick layer of New England fog clinging to the grey granite steps of the family court. I walked into the courtroom directly from a sunrise memorial service for a non-commissioned officer I had served with years ago, a somber duty that no civilian crisis could ever induce me to reschedule. I was dressed in my pristine Army class service uniform, every ribbon and crest aligned with mathematical precision. In the gallery, the Vance family had already mobilized, occupying the rows like patrons at a private theater function. Arthur took one look at me, leaned toward Evelyn, and let his lips curl into a distinct, audible smirk. "Look at her," he murmured to his brother. "She thinks this family crisis is a Sunday administrative parade." I did not turn around. I sat at the empty table designated for opposing counsel, unfolded my single folder, and maintained an absolute, unbothered posture. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded calmly on the polished oak table, my spine straight and my chin leveled. My eyes remained as quiet and unreadable as a frozen lake. For 12 years I had shrunk myself to fit into their narrow rooms, allowing their casual cruelty to pass over me like wind over stone. But a courtroom was not their dinner table. This was a structured arena governed by rules of evidence and constitutional procedures, a domain where arrogance without substance was a fatal liability. I listened to the low chatter of the room without moving a muscle, anchoring myself in a profound stillness that the surrounding noise could not touch. When Judge Marion Whitfield, a woman in her 60s with razor-sharp eyes, and the unhurried aura of a veteran jurist, called the court to order, Preston Cole rose with practiced, Ivy League swagger. He spoke for 25 minutes, weaving a polished narrative that painted Julian as the stable, financially impeccable corporate anchor of our daughter's life. Conversely, he described my military schedule as professionally itinerant and inherently volatile, arguing that a reservist mother subject to immediate deployment could not provide the consistency a 10-year-old child required. He framed Julian's immense income as the ultimate guarantee of a traditional, secure American upbringing, treating my service as a disqualifying domestic liability. When it was my turn, I stood up slowly, smoothed the front of my jacket, and looked directly at the bench. "Good morning, Your Honor," I said, my voice quiet, even, and entirely devoid of theatrical tremor. Major Clara Vance, appearing pro se on behalf of the respondent, former Judge Advocate General's Corps, United States Army. The introduction landed in the room like a heavy stone, dropped into a completely still pond. Behind me I heard the sharp, sudden intake of Arthur's breath, cut off mid-sound as if his smirk had suddenly turned to ash in his throat. Preston Cole's fountain pen stopped moving across his legal pad entirely, hovering in midair as he stared at me, the casual confidence draining from his face in real time. Julian was called to the witness stand next, adjusting his tailored suit, determined to project the image of an untouchable financial executive. Under my direct cross-examination, I steered him gently into the trap his own arrogance had constructed. I asked him basic questions about financial transparency, allowing him to boast about his immaculate oversight. "Mr. Vance," I asked, keeping my tone mild, "you have testified under oath that your financial disclosures are entirely complete, correct?" Julian smiled, triumphant, looking at the judge. "I am a senior director of accounts, Your Honor. I manage millions in corporate capital. Every dollar of my marital assets is accounted for, transparent, and legally documented." I picked up the first document from my folder, an exhibit that Cole's team had received months ago in the discovery phase but had completely ignored. "Then let us discuss Exhibit G," I said, passing the marked document to the bailiff. "This is an active corporate bank account registered to a Shell LLC under your sole name, established 4 months ago. And this is Exhibit C, documenting a $43,000 transfer from your joint marital savings into your sister's account just weeks before filing. You did not disclose either of these under oath. Julian's jaw tightened, a sudden, panicked sweat breaking across his forehead. Those were business loans, he stammered, his eyes darting wildly. They were redundant. Loans with no promissory notes, no interest structures, and no corporate registration. I asked, stepping closer to the stand. Mr. Vance, you just swore under the penalty of perjury that no such assets existed. Preston Cole half rose from his chair, his hands shaking as he looked at Julian, realizing with absolute horror that his own client had lied to him and walked straight into a fatal trap of Manthe. Cole started to stammer an objection, then sank back down, realizing that drawing more attention to the fraudulent documents would only seal their fate. Judge Whitfield's expression turned remarkably cold. She slammed her gavel down with a sharp, echoing crack that shattered the remaining silence of the gallery. Court is in recess for 15 minutes, she announced, her eyes fixed on Julian with severe disapproval. Mr. Cole, I suggest you advise your client very carefully. Part 4. Weigh in the granitis pokey. The echoing snap of Judge Whitfield's gavel dissolved into a chaotic rustle of shifting chairs and hushed, panicked murmurs. I stepped out of the heavy double doors of the courtroom and walked toward the quiet end of the wide stone corridor, stopping by a tall arched balcony that overlooked the rain-slicked streets of Boston. The air out here was cool, carrying the sharp, clean scent of damp earth. I stood with my hands resting lightly on the stone balustrade, watching the grey clouds slowly fracture over the city. For the first time all morning, I let myself take a slow, deep breath, allowing the rigid tension of the courtroom to settle into an absolute, unyielding calm. A few moments later, the heavy sound of measured footsteps echoed behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Arthur Vance approached slowly, the unmistakable, towering posture of the retired corporate law titan noticeably diminished. He stopped a few feet away, leaning against the stone structure, none of the patronizing bravado from the Michelin-starred anniversary dinner left in his expression. Up close, I could see the years on him differently. He looked old, unmoored, and deeply shaken by a version of reality he had never accounted for in his billion-dollar boardrooms. You were a judge advocate general, Arthur said, his voice unusually quiet, stripped of its habitual chick-tung edge. It wasn't a question. It was the heavy realization of a man staring at a truth he had spent a decade actively ignoring. I turned my head slightly, my expression entirely neutral. I was. For 9 active years, Arthur. I directed courts-martial, investigated institutional contract fraud, and ran administrative separation boards before I transitioned to the reserves. Arthur stared at my face, his sharp eyes searching my features as if trying to locate the submissive, quiet daughter-in-law he thought he knew inside the uniform standing before him now. Why didn't you ever say anything in 12 years, Clara? Not once at a single holiday dinner, not even when... He trailed off, looking down at his hands, a sudden flash of profound embarrassment crossing his face. Because nobody ever asked, I replied plainly, my tone completely devoid of malice. Not you, not Evelyn, and certainly not Julian after the first few months of our marriage. I mentioned a federal procurement case early in our marriage, and Julian told me in the kitchen that army talk made the family uncomfortable, so I stopped mentioning it. It is always easier to fade into the background than to keep explaining your worth to people who have already decided you are nothing more than a convenient accessory to their lifestyle. Arthur flinched, a look of genuine shame settling deep into the lines of his face, as the memories of a decade of casual condescension surfaced. Before Arthur could speak, the heavy glass doors at the far end of the hallway swung open. The sharp, frantic sound of an argument cut through the quiet corridor. Julian was walking out of the private consultation room, his face pale and contorted with rage, gesturing wildly at Preston Cole. Cole was fiercely snapping his briefcase shut, completely unzed by his client's anger, his voice carrying clearly down the hall. "You lied to this firm under a signed verification, Julian. You committed perjury in a court of record. We are salvaging a settlement now, or I am filing a motion to withdraw as your counsel before the judge reconvenes." Right behind them, my sister stepped out of the courthouse elevator, holding the hand of my 10-year-old daughter. Julian had explicitly obtained a special court order to keep Lily in the private family waiting room all morning, intending to parade her before the thumbpan as part of a heavily orchestrated media strategy to project the image of a doting, present corporate father. But his calculated theatre had completely backfired. Lily had walked out into the corridor at the exact moment her father's polished, untouchable facade was crumbling into desperate, ugly shouting. Lily stopped dead in her tracks, her wide, intelligent eyes moving from her father's panicked, unraveled state to where I stood at the end of the hall. She broke away from my sister's grip and ran toward me, her sneakers squeaking loudly against the polished marble floor. She threw her arms around my waist, burying her face into the rigid fabric of my uniform jacket. I knelt down immediately, wrapping my arms around her small frame, breathing in the familiar, comforting scent of her strawberry shampoo. "Mom," Lily whispered, pulling back just enough to look at my ribbons and the crest on my lapel, her voice filled with a profound, searching curiosity. "Were you really a lawyer who protects people? A real one?" I offered her a soft, entirely unguarded smile, brushing a stray lock of hair from her forehead. "I still am, sweetie. I just haven't needed to use that part of my voice for a long time, but I am using it today." Lily considered my words with the deep, quiet seriousness 10-year-olds reserve for moments that change their worldview. She squeezed my hand tightly, a look of fierce, protective pride settling into her stubborn chin, a chin she had inherited directly from my own mother's line. The illusion of the all-powerful corporate father had vanished from her mind forever, replaced by the quiet, unshakable strength of the mother who stood before her. Part 5. After the storm, the courtroom reconvened just after 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The atmosphere had shifted entirely. The heavy, self-assured arrogance that had filled the room in the morning had dissolved into a quiet, earned stillness. When Judge Whitfield settled into her seat, she gathered the documents with the unhurried composure of someone who had seen every manner of performance a bench could offer. "I have thoroughly reviewed the evidence and the testimony presented during the morning session," she began, her sharp eyes fixing directly onto Julian's table. "And I want to note for the record that this case has developed in a manner very different from the petitioner's initial representations." She leaned forward, her tone even but unmistakably severe. "On the matter of child custody, the court finds that Major Vance's military obligations, including her extensive history as a judge advocate, do not constitute grounds for limiting her parental rights. In fact, the evidence of her stability, professional discipline, and consistent presence in her daughter's life weighs heavily in her favor. Primary physical custody of the minor child is awarded to Major Vance, with a standard, supervised visitation schedule for Mr. Vance, subject to periodic judicial review. Behind me, Evelyn made a small, fractured sound, the sharp exhale of air leaving a room all at once. Furthermore, on the matter of marital assets, Judge Whitfield continued, her gavel resting loosely beneath her hand, the court finds clear, undeniable evidence of undisclosed accounts and fraudulent asset concealment executed by the petitioner in violation of standard discovery requirements. Given this flagrant pattern of conduct, the court awards Major Vance sole ownership of the marital home, along with 65% of the couple's combined liquid assets and investment portfolios. Mr. Vance is hereby ordered to return the full $43,000 transferred to his sister's name, with interest calculated from the exact date of transfer. Additionally, because the petitioner purposefully misled the court under oath, he will bear 100% of the litigation costs associated with this proceeding. The documentation regarding the fraudulent LLC will be referred to the District Attorney's Office for potential criminal prosecution under state perjury statutes. This court is adjourned. When I walked down the marble steps of the courthouse, the afternoon light felt completely different than it had that morning, sharper, cleaner, as if a long, suffocating storm had finally passed through the city. The burning anger I had carried during the final, exhausting months of my marriage had burned itself out on the courtroom floor, replaced by a profound, immovable sense of peace. My sister was waiting by the iron gates, and the moment Lily saw me, she broke away and ran toward me, her arms wrapping fiercely around my waist. I knelt down, tucking the brown folder of evidence under my arm, and held her close, breathing in the solid, real weight of the only dynamic in my life that had never been in question. "Did we win, Mom?" she asked quietly into my shoulder. I pulled back, looking at her bright, searching eyes, and smiled a completely unguarded smile. "We told the truth, Lily. In the end, that is always enough." A year has passed since that rainy Tuesday in Boston. Julian did not appeal the ruling. His new legal counsel wisely advised against it once the full financial picture was exposed to the state. Facing the threat of a formal perjury indictment and intense institutional pressure, he resigned from his executive position at the financial firm shortly after the trial. I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I didn't care to follow the details of his decline. The true victory of that year didn't belong to the courtroom banquet, nor did it live in the quiet satisfaction of watching a wealthy family realize exactly who they had been dismissing all along. The real victory unfolds on ordinary Thursday evenings in a home that finally feels mine entirely. I sit at a sun-drenched kitchen table, helping Lily with her history homework, answering her bright, endless questions about international law and the Constitution with absolute transparency. I no longer feel the heavy requirement to shrink my intellect or hide my achievements to keep a husband comfortable. The silence I maintain now is no longer a tactical shield against arrogance. It is the quiet, unremarkable freedom of a woman who is seen completely for who she actually is. I spent 12 years waiting for a room to hear my true voice. Now I use that voice to teach my daughter how to stand her ground in a world full of people who have already decided not to listen. From which city or corner of the world are you listening? Please drop the name of your city or state in the comments below. And if you are anxious to see the next chapter of this journey, please comment next part, please. Don't forget to hit that like button, share this message of hope, and subscribe to the channel.